Thanks very much. I want to give immediate credit to my co-authors, Craig Mactons, Jeff Ball, and Joel Ingram, who did the lion's share of thinking behind this presentation. And this work aligns with the JOSM implementation plan. I'm going to talk about status and trend monitoring of migratory birds and the gap analysis we did and how to augment those programs. But before I do that, I want to step back into 2011 and where we're at in the thinking about how to approach monitoring in the oil sands. And I really appreciated Dr. Hansen's talk today, and hopefully I will hit on some of the themes that will resonate, which was we did look at the literature to identify common procedural and design flaws, and we looked at monitoring globally, and yes, there's a large number of lessons to be learned there, and we wanted to apply those lessons in this context. So we wanted to think very carefully about setting very clear goals and objectives. So what question are we asking to characterize the stressors in this landscape, to develop conceptual models of how stressors and responses link together, and to make sure we could detect those stressor impacts and to know the limits of those responses, and then to ensure connection to decision making. And I think that last point is an ongoing conversation that we're developing even today. So the question that we were starting with here is, what is the impact of oil sands on migratory birds? So migratory birds are these species that are covered under our Migratory Birds Convention Act. They include hunted species such as waterfowl, and songbird species, including those that are also listed under the Species at Risk Act or provincial wildlife legislation. And then what is the linkage of those species to land disturbance or footprint here? But we didn't just take that for granted. We wanted to question that, to really prod that and say, is there a legitimate reason to be looking at that question? And we developed conceptual models. So these are migratory birds that spend their summers in the boreal, and then they're also in the migration and overwintering in the US through South America, and looked at how stressors link to those. We used the literature to develop that, and then convened an expert panel from experts across Canada who evaluated these, ranked the responses, and said, yes, land disturbance is likely having the highest influence on these populations. Right now, that is likely agriculture and forestry, but down the roads, oil sands. So, diving into that, we thought, okay, so what approach are we going to take on this? And we divided into two directions, which I think really are themes that Jim touched on heavily throughout his presentation, which is if change is occurring, is it changing? How is it changing? And is it going up or down? This is real stock and trade work for Environment Canada. We have a long history of monitoring programs for migratory birds, of measuring these populations through space and time and generating trends. The challenge is that takes a very long time, and once you've found a difference, a change, it's very hard to go back in time and figure out why that happened. So the idea here is to make sure we know why. So to have complementary programs that go forward, so cause effects monitoring, effects assessment programs that can help us explain those mechanisms. So we've taken a model-based approach to assess and relate stressors and targets and try to explain impacts. So Jim's touched on much of that work. Lisa Mahan in the next session will talk a bit more about that, so I urge you to catch that presentation. And the nice thing is that there are these predictive tools that can help us make decisions now, and then those trends can help validate those through time. So even before then I get into diving into the trend monitoring, which is where I want to spend the rest of this talk, is before we could think of the design, how we would evaluate programs, how we would augment them, It was really about asking some questions about, okay, so what rate of change do we want to detect? We don't have CCME type guidelines. We don't have specific triggers. I can't tell you at a certain rate that the population is going to crash. What we did draw from is guidelines that are present within our species at risk legislation and that are national standards or international standards in bird migration or in bird monitoring. So changes such as 50% in 10 years or a 50% change in 20 years, those are things we would want to detect. And the challenge here in design is that these populations go up and down through time and interannually. And if you have a huge change like this, you have a very different design than you might have if your population is varying a small amount. And the challenge is we don't have long-term monitoring in these systems, so we don't know what that is. So that's part of our challenge going forward to figure that out. The other thing is, what is the appropriate scale to monitor? At what scale do you want the answer about where these population changes are occurring and why they're changing? So you can pick the size of a lease, you could look at the oil sands areas. Ideally, you would have a multi-scalar program. For the purposes of evaluation and our design, we looked at the scale of the 3 oil sands areas, but that's a starting point. So we didn't want to reinvent the wheel. We said, how well are existing programs working to assess status and trends of birds? We looked at 3 programs. The first is the Breeding Bird Survey. This runs across North America. It's a volunteer program that runs roadside. It's run since 1966. But there's only 6 to 9 routes that are run in the oil sands area annually. And then we also looked at the Alberta Biodiversity Monitoring Institute, which is that systematic design that Jim just described, but is a more recent program. And then for waterfowl, we looked at the Waterfowl Breeding Population and Habitat Survey. This is a program run with the Canadian Wildlife Service and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. It's run since 1955. It has aerial and ground transect surveys that also run across the oil sands area. So I'll talk about the waterfowl results first. And that black line across the bottom there is our trend monitoring target. We want to be able to detect a trend of 50% change in 20 years. And the happy story here is that by 15, 20 years, we're catching about 70% of waterfowl species in the area. And the species that we're not catching are those that are more peripheral to the boreal, like they're essentially prairie species. So this is a good news story here. And there's a more fulsome report that I'm happy to provide. But just a summary here is that duck populations, this is for all species in the last 20 years, that there's a slight positive trend here. But this program is performing well in terms of trend monitoring. Where we're lacking information is in breeding distribution and in assessing those cause and effect relationships. What are the impacts of oil sands on these populations? And so using the resources from JOSM, we're putting those with a program that's led by Ducks Unlimited, and there's a poster in the lobby there. So, and please catch Stuart Slatterly about that program. For the ability to detect trends for land birds, this was work led by Alberta Innovates and Jim in particular. And this is a 200-page report that I am summarizing in one slide, but let me hit the key stories here. One is that I'm just showing the Alberta Biodiversity Monitoring Institute because the BBS performed much less well. But in this program, so that black line is our precision target, again, that 50% in 20 years, that it's doing very, very well for a number of species. But that for a number of species, even if we try to modify through simple levers like adding more sites, visiting more frequently, things you can do when you throw money at a program, right? We still miss a number of species. And that by far the most important thing here is the duration of these programs. It takes a long time to monitor and to detect trends. So you can see on the right-hand side there that this is showing how we're augmenting the number of sites. Even when we get into a situation by 20 years where where say we go from 64 to double sites to quadruple sites, it doesn't make that big a difference in the percentage of species that reach our target. The big deal here is running the program for a long time. So to me, that's a big message about stabilizing these programs into the future. So the question then for us is, okay, so those species that we didn't catch, can we do something to design the program to augment these better? And certainly the results of the analysis showed yes, if you take a stratified design, if you drive your points into areas where you're likely to detect species, you can improve monitoring. But there's a catch. You can't do this for too many species. So the design becomes logistically difficult, and eventually a systematic design is going to make more sense. You should just add lots and lots and lots of points. So there's some trade-offs here for us in terms of how good we want to make these programs, and particularly for rarer species. So where we decided we could go next is that we would try to incorporate a smaller suite of species as an initial first strike, to take this as an incremental approach. So of the 117, of the 117 breeding birds that were assessed, we took 37 species that were either not adequately monitored or else they had a federal or provincial listing status, and we prioritized them by whether there was a conservation concern, so there was a known vulnerability to disturbance, they had status ranks, which means they had a very small population or a declining trend, and then look for efficiencies in sampling methods. So could we go to one location or use one survey technique to try and incorporate these? And we identified a suite of old forest species as the first priority, followed by wetland species would be the next tier. So the Old Forest Landbird program launched in 2014. We went out last summer and collected and initiated a program that targeted 6 old forest species. This included a Canada warbler, which is threatened under the Species at Risk Act, and black-throated green warbler, which is special concern under the Alberta Wildlife Act, bay-breasted warbler, Cape May warbler, brown creeper, and red-breasted nuthatch. So we had a stratified design targeting these old forests, and then we also went back to sites that had been previously visited in the past by other studies in hopes to improve that interannual variation so we can figure out how these populations are changing and come up with the most efficient design. This program last summer collected 2,500 point counts, which is phenomenal, and that is such a gift from these resources. We have never had the ability to collect that type of data, so thank you for that. That's quite a legacy. This is among 123 survey areas that included 715 sites that were revisited. And those areas on the map there, you can see, this is an area, this is bigger than the Maritimes that we've gone across here. And those larger circles are the helicopter survey areas, and the smaller areas were accessed by truck. And we doubled the detection frequency of the species here than we would with a systematic design. So this program will continue forward in the coming year as a collaboration with the University of Alberta and the Alberta Biodiversity Monitoring Institute, and I'm very pleased to see that. So what have we learned? Well, first, our appropriate monitoring design depends on the question, depends on the spatial scale and the desired rate of trend detection. So what we took here was our best estimate, and I think what we want to hear from stakeholders and others is, are we answering the questions that you want? Is this the information you wanted? And so, these conversations are starting to happen now, and we're very anxious to hear that. The program duration is more important for trend detection than increasing the frequency of sites or number of sites. So please, let's focus on stabilizing, getting a long-term program in place. These stratified designs are useful for catching some of these rare species, these species we might be worried about, but to a point. We're going to have to think differently if we want to incorporate lots and lots of species. And my last point is just to reinforce some of the things that Jim was talking about, in that trend detection for monitoring takes a long time. It's going to be 10 to 15 years before we see trends even for common species. So we need predictive tools now to estimate those trends, to predict those impacts so we can help decision making now. And I'm very pleased to see that going forward in other aspects of the program. Thank you.
See if there's is there a question or two? This microphone here.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Great presentation. I wondering, you're doing a lot of great work. However, have you considered, or have you local organizations involved? Like I represent many organizations, including Nature Alberta. Have you ever considered partnering with them? And with a little bit of training, you could probably enhance your data collection immensely if you partnered with some very knowledgeable and very, very informed people. So I would, are you doing that? Or I'm suggesting if you're not, you should be. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. Yeah, I think that's a great idea. And part of the challenge of having those resources very quickly was the need to hit the ground running and put a program into place. So I think it wasn't as broad-based as it could have been. And I think now, as we found our feet a bit, that we can start to develop more of those linkages and partnerships. And I think some of the technologies that will also be discussed later this afternoon with Aaron would actually increase that ability to partner. And certainly that's approaches we've had to use in other provinces, and so I'd anticipate seeing this for sure. So I'd be happy to talk about it further. Okay.
Danielle Colbert, Alberta Energy Regulator. I guess I have a question for you and a comment. I'm just thinking of the review that you've done in terms of methodology and design and comparison of programs. So are those protocols and standards that you're developing published, and so that they could be followed by others? Because I find in the regulatory context, I often get, I review monitoring programs, and there's wide differences in approaches and consistency, and then the programs can't be compared. So just a comment, it's a question for you, but also a comment in general that it would be very valuable that any review and standardization is published so that others would be able to follow it.
Yes, thank you. We're working on it, and certainly access to those reports and the consultant reports are, I'm happy to give those out.
Okay, we'll up, and I know you were there waiting there, so we won't miss you for sure. We'll get you.
Yes, good morning. Ted Heinmarch, Nature Alberta. I just want to follow up on the question Joseph mentioned, as our organization is heavily involved with the citizen science part. I was just wondering if you were aware or had made any use of the material in two fairly large volumes of Breeding Bird Atlas of Alberta that Nature Alberta produced, one from the early 90s and one in the 2003 to 2006 era, which captured breeding bird activity and numbers.
I just realized that I neglected to include my acknowledgement slide. And within there, I have acknowledgement of the Boreal Avian Modeling Project, which has actually collated all existing studies of birds in Alberta as well as across the boreal in North America. And so so in terms of site revisits, all those data would have been in the Boreal Avian Modeling Project. We use those models to prioritize and figure out our study design. So yes, if that was contributed and we had that atlas data, we would have used it, yes.
I'm Melissa Gory with EcoJustice. Thank you for the very interesting talk.
I'm so happy you're not grilling me on the stand right now. Hi, Melissa.
No, very friendly. I was just curious. I know that some of the individuals at the U of A are doing some work around migratory birds and tailings ponds in particular, and I was just wondering, is Environment Canada doing any work either with the U of A or on their own specifically about the impacts of tailing ponds on migratory birds?
We have an advisory capacity on that program, and Joel Ingram, my co-author, was on the committee that was on an advisory board under that program that was led by Colin Cassidy St. Clair, but we're not undertaking research per se on that.